300 nobles stood frozen, glasses raised, conversations dead, every gaze locked on the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne standing at the center of the marble floor. Lucien's voice was low. It never needed to be loud to wound. You have embarrassed this family. A duchess does not defend servants in public. She does not make herself the spectacle of the evening. Selene didn't flinch. She had spent 2 years flinching, 2 years rewriting herself, shrinking herself, erasing every warm and honest part of who she was, all to become the perfect woman standing beside him. And it was never enough. She looked at him, really looked, and in the silence of 300 watching eyes, she said the 7 words that would break him long after the night was over. I think you fell in love with an idea, not a person. She turned and walked away, and Duke Lucien Blackthorne, the most feared nobleman in the kingdom, stood alone on the marble floor and felt, for the very first time in his life, something he had no name for. It wasn't anger. It was the sound of something irreplaceable. Breaking. Chapter 1. The old Duke was dying in the way powerful men hate most, slowly, visibly, without dignity. He lay in the great bed of the East Chamber, the same bed where 3 generations of Blackthorne men had taken their last breath, propped against silk pillows that had been fluffed and arranged by hands he could no longer feel. The fire was high, the room smelled of cedar wood and medicine, and the particular stillness that settles into a space when everyone inside it knows the end is near, but no one will say so aloud. Lucien stood at the window. He did not sit at his father's bedside. That was not how the Blackthorne men did things. They stood. They controlled the room with their posture when they could no longer control anything else. "Come closer," his father said. "I'm dying, not contagious." Lucien turned. He crossed the room and stood at the foot of the bed with his hands clasped behind his back, the unconscious posture of a man who had learned, from the very figure lying before him, that composure was the only inheritance worth passing down. His father studied him for a long moment. The old Duke's eyes were still sharp. Whatever was failing, it wasn't that. "You will marry before the first snow," he said. No preamble, no softening. "Or the title passes to your cousin Edmund." Lucien's expression did not change. "Edmund is incompetent, thoroughly," his father agreed, "which is why I suggest you find a wife." The word sat in the room between them, like an object neither man particularly wanted to touch. In 32 years, the subject of Lucien's marriage had been raised, avoided, debated, and abandoned so many times that it had acquired the quality of an old argument, exhausted, unresolved, permanent. "You have 2 months, his father said. "After that, my hands are tied. The terms of the estate charter are not sentimental." Lucien nodded once. That was the entire conversation. He returned to his study that evening and approached the problem the way he approached every problem, with method, without emotion, and with the absolute certainty that there was a correct answer if one was simply rigorous enough to find it. He needed a wife, not a companion, not a confidant, not a woman to love him or be loved by him. Love was a variable he had long since removed from his personal calculations as too unstable to be useful. He needed a duchess. A woman who would stand beside him at every event, represent the Blackthorne name with precision, command the household without friction, and give the kingdom's gossips absolutely nothing of interest to discuss. He needed, in short, a woman who was excellent on paper. He began with a list. His secretary, a meticulous man named Forsyth, who had learned over many years not to show surprise at anything the Duke requested, produced files on 11 noble daughters within 4 days. Lucien reviewed them at his desk in the quiet of late evening, with the same focused attention he gave to property contracts. The first was eliminated for youth, too recently out of society to have proven herself in any meaningful way. The second, for her family's political entanglement with the Western House, which would make the alliance complicated rather than useful. The third he had met twice in passing and recalled as having a laugh that carried. The fourth had published anonymously a series of opinions on land reform in a cultural journal, which suggested either strong principles or poor discretion, and either way was inconvenient. He worked through the list with the clean efficiency of a man pruning a garden. By the time he reached the 11th file, only one name remained that had survived every objection he could manufacture: Lady Selene Ashford. He read her file twice. 24 years old, second daughter of the Earl of Ashford, respectable family, unremarkable political footprint, no scandals. Educated at the Thornfield Academy for Ladies, which had a solid, if unflashy, reputation for producing composed and capable women. Her tutors had described her as quietly intelligent and exceptionally composed. The Countess of Whitmore, a woman whose opinion carried considerable social weight, had mentioned her specifically after the Midsummer Gala, noting her elegant restraint. Elegant restraint. Those two words did something in Lucien's mind that he would have called satisfaction. It meant she understood the first principle of aristocratic womanhood, that the greatest power a noblewoman could exercise in public was the power of withholding, saying less, feeling less, showing nothing that hadn't been carefully chosen. She sounded, on paper, exactly like what he needed. He approved the meeting. The introduction was arranged in the formal drawing room of the Ashford estate. Tea, her parents present, the conversation moving along the careful, well-worn roads of polite aristocratic exchange. She answered his questions without nervousness. She smiled at precisely the correct moments. She did not attempt to impress him with cleverness or warmth or any of the performances he had observed in previous introductions from women who wanted too visibly to be chosen. She was composed. She was graceful. She was, in every visible respect, suitable. He told her parents he would proceed with the engagement. He did not ask Selene what she thought. It didn't occur to him. He returned to Blackthorne that evening, told Forsyth to begin the legal arrangements, and wrote a brief letter to his father. "I have found a suitable candidate. The matter will be resolved before winter." He sealed it. He sent it. He went to sleep. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet bedroom in the Ashford estate, a young woman sat at her dressing table and looked at her own reflection for a long, private moment, and allowed herself, carefully, to hope. She had decided, in those brief formal hours, that the Duke was a man of depth disguised as coldness, that somewhere beneath the composure was something worth reaching for. She would spend the next 2 years learning what it cost to reach for something that did not reach back. But that night, she only hoped. And the candle burned, and the city was quiet, and neither of them had any idea what they were walking toward. Chapter 2. The wedding was beautiful, the way contracts are beautiful. Precise, considered, entirely without warmth. The flowers had been chosen by Lucien's housekeeper according to the season and the Blackthorne family colours, white roses and deep blue larkspur. And they were perfect, and they meant nothing. The guests arrived in their finest and arranged themselves in the cathedral pews like pieces on a chessboard, each one placed according to social weight. The organ played. The light came through the stained glass in the particular golden way it always did at that hour. Selene walked down the aisle and looked, by every account, exquisite. Lucien stood at the altar and looked, by every account, like a man completing a necessary task. The vows were the traditional ones. They spoke them both clearly, without hesitation, and the bishop nodded at the appropriate moment. So, when Lucien slid the ring onto her finger, his touch lasted exactly as long as ceremony required. When they were pronounced married, he looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. It was simply uninhabited. She had told herself, in the weeks between the engagement and this moment, that she understood what she was entering. She had not told herself a lie, exactly. She had simply told herself an incomplete truth. The reception moved with the efficiency of a military operation. Lucien spoke with the right people for the right lengths of time. He did not ignore her, but neither did he seek her out across the room. She was the Duchess of Blackthorne now, and a duchess was not someone to be sought. She was already where she was supposed to be. At precisely the appropriate hour, the guests began to leave. Carriage after carriage rolled away into the autumn dark. The great house of Blackthorne settled into its nighttime quiet, the particular silence of a large home that has just swallowed something new into itself. Lucien had retired to his study. Selene did not know this yet. She was still in the entrance hall, still in her wedding gown, a thing of ivory silk that had taken 3 seamstresses 6 weeks to construct. When she heard it, a small sound. The kind of sound that most people do not hear, because most people are not listening for it. A stifled breath. The high, thin edge of someone trying very hard not to cry. She found the girl around the corner from the main stair, in the narrow servants' corridor. A housemaid, young, perhaps 16, crouched over the remains of a decorative vase that lay in pieces across the stone floor. Blue and white porcelain, shattered beyond recovery. The girl looked up and saw the Duchess of Blackthorne on her wedding night, in her wedding dress, standing in the doorway of the servants' corridor. The colour drained from her face. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I'm so sorry I didn't hear anyone. The tray slipped and I—" "Stop," Selene said, gently. "Are you hurt?" "No, I—" The girl blinked. That was apparently not the question she had been expecting. "No, Your Grace." Selene looked at the floor, at the pieces, at the girl's hands, shaking slightly, hovering over the shards as though she didn't know where to begin. Then she gathered her silk skirts, lowered herself to her knees on the stone floor, and began to help. The girl made a sound like a small animal. "Your Grace, you cannot— your dress." "The dress is mine to ruin," Selene said. "Help me with the larger pieces first." They worked in silence for a moment. The vase had been old. Selene could tell from the weight of the fragments, the particular depth of the glaze. But it had not, she suspected, been irreplaceable. It was the kind of thing that lived on a side table for decades without anyone looking at it directly. When the worst of it was cleared, she rose, smoothed her skirts, and told the girl to fetch a broom. She told her also, quietly and without theatre, that accidents happened to everyone, and that she need not be afraid of consequences for an honest mistake. The girl looked at her as though she was trying to determine if she was real. Selene returned to the main corridor. She did not know she had been watched. Lucien had come down from his study for a glass of water, a habit, nothing more, and had paused at the turn of the corridor. He had stood in the shadow of the doorway and watched his wife of 6 hours lower herself to the floor of a servant's passage in 2,000 pounds of ivory silk to pick up pieces of a broken vase with a housemaid. He observed it, the way he observed most things he did not immediately understand, with stillness and something that functioned like analysis. A lapse in judgment, he concluded. Novel circumstance. She will recalibrate. She will. He returned to his study. He finished his water. He sat for a moment at his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and he thought about the household protocols he had prepared. 43 pages, precise and thorough, covering every aspect of the Duchess's role and responsibilities, from the management of social correspondence to the correct order of precedence at private dinners. He had intended to present them in the morning. Instead, he walked to her bedroom door, set the bound document on the floor outside it, and returned to his own chamber without knocking. He fell asleep quickly, the way men do when they believe they have managed a situation correctly. Selene found the document when she came upstairs. She stood in the doorway of her new bedroom, a room she had never slept in, full of furniture she had not chosen, looking out over gardens she had not yet walked. And she picked up the stack of papers from the floor and carried it to the writing desk by the window. She sat down. She opened to the first page, and in the dark and the quiet, with the candle making a small, warm circle of light around her hands, she read every word. Not because she had been told to, because she was trying still, against the weight of the evening, against the vase, and the cold altar, and the ring placed without tenderness, to understand the man she had married, to find something in the architecture of his rules that might tell her who he was when no one was watching. She read until the candle burned low. She found nothing she recognized as a person. But she kept looking. Chapter 3. She began on a Monday. Not because Monday held any particular significance, but because Selene had always been the kind of person who needed a clear starting point, a seam in time she could point to and say, "Here. This is where I decided." She sent 3 letters before breakfast. One to the Blackthorne social secretary, requesting the full calendar of the season's obligations. One to the Countess of Whitmore, asking, carefully, without revealing too much, for the name of the woman who had tutored her daughters in political history. And one to a language instructor in the city whose name she had remembered from a conversation at the Midsummer Gala 2 years prior. Because Lucien conducted 3 of his most important trade correspondences in French, and she had noticed that he always read those letters last. She was going to stop being someone he noticed with faint disappointment. She was going to become someone he could not improve upon. The tutors arrived within the week. Madame Voss for deportment and social protocol, a small, iron-spined woman in her 60s, who had trained the daughters of 4 noble houses, and who looked at Selene on the first morning the way a sculptor looks at a block of stone. Not unkindly, but without sentiment. Monsieur Albrecht for French and the finer points of diplomatic correspondence. A retired parliamentary aide named Mr. Calder for political history and current affairs, because a duchess who could not speak intelligently about the legislation her husband's seat influenced was, as Selene had quietly concluded, a duchess who would always be managed around rather than consulted. She studied the way other women sew, steadily, without fanfare, in whatever quiet hours she could find. She memorized the precedence tables until she could recite them in her sleep. She learned which families were currently feuding, and over what, which alliances were fragile, and which were merely performing fragility, which topics could be raised safely at dinner, and which required the careful diplomatic swerve she was learning to execute with increasing naturalness. She practiced the particular art of being present in a room without drawing attention, of listening more than she spoke, of asking questions that made the person answering feel both intelligent and seen. She was, by any measure, a dedicated student. Occasionally, Lucien noticed. The first time was at a dinner for the Hargrove family, 6 weeks into their marriage. She had guided the conversation away from a political undercurrent that could have sharpened into something embarrassing for the host, redirecting it so smoothly that no one at the table, except, she suspected, Lucien, had registered that anything required redirecting. In the carriage home, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That was well managed." 4 words. She held them the entire ride home and set them somewhere careful inside herself, the way one sets down something that might break. The second time, he reviewed the draft of a formal correspondence she had prepared for a charity luncheon she was hosting in the Blackthorne name. He read it standing at his desk, and she stood across from him and did not fidget, because she had been practicing not fidgeting. He set it down. "It's competent," he said. He had not been expecting competent. She could hear it in the slight recalibration beneath the word. She smiled and said nothing, which was also something she had been practicing. But then his eyes moved back to the page. The 3rd paragraph positions us too close to the Alderton Foundation. Given the current questions about their finances, that association is premature. He handed it back, revised the framing. She revised it that evening. She thought about the Alderton Foundation while she did. She had not known about the financial questions, which meant there was a layer of current intelligence she was not yet accessing. She wrote another letter the next morning, this one to a woman she had met twice at social functions who seemed, beneath her pleasantries, to know everything about everyone. The gap closed, and Lucien moved the line. She did not understand it at first, thought each new critique was simply the natural refinement of legitimate standards. A Duchess of Blackthorne should speak more sparingly at mixed gatherings. Her gown at the Pemberton event had been striking in a way that drew the wrong kind of attention, individual attention, attention that landed on her rather than the family name. Her handling of Lady Ellsworth had been warm where it should have been cordial. Warm where it should have been cordial. She repeated that one to herself for days, turning it over, trying to locate the difference. She thought she understood it, eventually. Warmth suggested intimacy, and intimacy suggested the possibility of being known, and a duchess was not known. A duchess was recognized. There was a distinction, and it mattered, and she filed it away and adjusted. But there was always another, too direct in her opinions. Then, after she pulled back, too careful, too studied, not natural enough. The phrasing of an introduction had been slightly informal. The particular manner in which she had disagreed with Lord Fenwick at dinner had been admirable in principle, but poor in execution, given Fenwick's sensitivity. Her memory for names was excellent. He had said so, directly. But she smiled when she remembered them, and the smile made it look like performance. She stopped smiling when she remembered names. She wasn't sure exactly when she stopped tracking the compliments separately from the corrections. They had come often enough, early enough, to feel like a ratio, something she could improve through effort, a gap she was genuinely narrowing. But at some point, the ratio shifted. At some point, the compliments became rarer, and the corrections became quieter, more precise, more embedded in the fabric of daily exchange. And she understood, slowly, the way one understands something one has been refusing to name, that the line was not fixed, that it had never been fixed, that what Lucien had handed her on the first night was not a map to somewhere she could reach. It was an architecture she was meant to live inside, not to complete. She sat with that knowledge for one private evening, in the chair by the window of a room that still did not quite feel like hers, and she was quiet with it, because she had gotten very good at being quiet. Then she rose, and she kept going, because she had not yet found the thing she was really looking for, and she was not yet ready to admit she didn't know what it was. Chapter 4. The household had opinions. They kept them, professionally, to themselves, tucked beneath the smooth surface of pressed uniforms and lowered eyes, and the particular trained invisibility of people who had learned that the most valuable thing a servant could offer a great house was the convincing illusion that they were not quite there. Blackthorne's staff did not gossip. They did not speculate in the corridors or linger at doors. But they watched. They had always watched. It was, in the way of all large households, the primary occupation beneath the official one, the silent, continuous act of observation that allowed them to anticipate, to calibrate, to be in the right place before they were summoned. They knew the Duke's moods by the weight of his footstep on the main stair. They knew which days required extra care and which allowed a breath of ease. They had spent years learning the precise geography of Lucien Blackthorne's silences. And then the Duchess arrived, and they began learning her. Mrs. Haverford, the head housekeeper, a woman of 30 years' service, and the particular stillness of someone who had outlasted 3 different versions of this house, noticed it first. Not the Duchess herself, but the preparing, the small, private ritual that preceded every room Selene entered where the Duke was already present. A pause at the threshold. Never long. 2 seconds, perhaps. 3. Just long enough to make some invisible adjustment, like a musician tuning an instrument before a performance that no one else could hear. A slight settling of the shoulders, a smoothing of the expression into something correct and composed. And then she would enter, and she would be perfect, gracious and measured, and exactly everything the household protocols required. Mrs. Haverford watched this happen 17 times before she stopped counting. She said nothing to anyone. But in the evenings, in her small sitting room off the kitchen corridor, she held her teacup a little tighter than usual. The lady's maid, Dora, knew about the mornings. She knew because she was there for them, helping with the dressing, the hair, the small daily architecture of a duchess's presentation. In the early weeks, there had been conversation. Not intimate conversation. The Duchess was not careless with intimacy, but warm exchanges, small observations, the occasional dry remark about the density of the social calendar that had made Dora press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. Gradually, the remarks stopped. Not all at once. The way warmth leaves a room in winter is not all at once either. It is a slow, incremental withdrawing, and by the time you notice it fully, you cannot pinpoint when it began. The Duchess still spoke to her, still thanked her, still asked after her family, still possessed every quality that made her, in Dora's private estimation, the finest person in the house. But something was being rationed, as though she had learned, or decided, that warmth spent freely in the morning left her with less to calibrate in the rooms that mattered. Dora began laying out the day's dress before she arrived, so the Duchess would not have to make small decisions before she had composed herself for the larger ones. It was the only thing she could think to offer. Cook noticed the meals. Not what the Duchess ate, but how. In the early days, she had occasionally stopped in the kitchen corridor between engagements, drawn by the smell of something, and lingered for a moment with the unself-conscious pleasure of a person who simply liked food. Once she had asked what was in the sauce for the Thursday roast. Once she had tasted something offered from a spoon and made a sound of genuine delight that had made Cook feel, briefly and warmly, like the most accomplished person in the city. Those visits had stopped around the 3rd month. Cook did not mention it, but she began sending a small extra dish up with the evening tray, something sweet, something warm, without being asked, a private act of protest against something she could not quite name. Thomas was the youngest of the footmen. He was 19, still given occasionally to saying the exact thing he thought without the buffer of professional habit, which was simultaneously his greatest flaw and, in the opinion of most of the staff who had grown fond of him, his most useful quality. It was Thomas who said it. They were in the servants' hall, a quiet Tuesday, the kind of afternoon that left room for thought. Someone, Dora perhaps, had remarked on how composed the Duchess had seemed at the previous evening's dinner, how perfectly she had managed the table. Thomas looked up from his work. "She looks like someone taking a test," he said. "Every room. Like she already knows she's going to fail, but she's going to do everything right anyway." The hall went quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of something said wrongly. The quiet of something said too accurately, that everyone recognized, and no one had found words for yet. Mrs. Haverford set down her pen. She thought about the pause at the threshold, the 17 times she had stopped counting, because counting made it too real, made it a pattern rather than a habit, a diminishing rather than an adjustment. She thought about the woman who had knelt on the stone floor on her wedding night in ivory silk to help a frightened girl clean up broken pieces. That woman was still there. Mrs. Haverford was certain of it. She appeared in small moments, a look of genuine feeling that crossed the Duchess's face before she composed it away, a brief warmth in the eyes that arrived before the filter caught it. She was still there, still trying, but she was also disappearing. One careful erasure at a time. Thomas said nothing further. He returned to his work, apparently unaware that he had just articulated the quiet grief of an entire household. Outside, in the hall above, a door opened and closed. The sound of measured footsteps moved in one direction, paused, and moved in another. And in a room somewhere between those footsteps and everywhere they never quite reached, the Duchess of Blackthorne sat at her writing desk, composed and correct and completely alone, and she prepared herself to be perfect for another day. Chapter 5. Lady Mara Ellsworth had known Selene Ashford since they were 9 years old. She had known her through the phase of terrible watercolours and the phase of strong opinions about horses and the years of quiet, serious reading that preceded the years of warm, unserious laughter. She had known her through grief and through joy and through the various negotiations a young woman makes with the world as she learns its shape. She was, in every sense that mattered, someone who held a before, and it was the before that made the after impossible to ignore. They were at the Pemberton Autumn Gathering, a mid-season event, significant but not crucial, the kind of party that allowed people to breathe slightly more than the major occasions. Selene moved through it the way she moved through everything now, gracefully, precisely, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had studied the room before entering it and knew exactly where she was supposed to be. She was magnificent, technically. Mara watched her redirect a conversation with 2 words, watched her make an aging baron feel important without once saying anything untrue, watched her smile at exactly the correct warmth, enough to be charming, not enough to be intimate, and then move on before anyone could reach for more. Mara watched all of this and felt something low and quiet settle in her chest. Later, in one of the side rooms, they had 5 minutes alone. The way old friends sometimes carve out 5 minutes at these events, a small stolen parenthesis in the performance. They stood together by the window with their champagne, and for a moment it was almost like before. Almost. "You look wonderful," Mara said. "Thank you. Precise. Warm enough." Mara looked at her, the way she used to, directly, without the careful angle that social occasions demanded. "Selene," she kept her voice low, "you used to actually laugh." It landed quietly between them, not as an accusation, as a fact, stated with the gentle grief of someone who had been carrying it for some time and needed, finally, to set it down somewhere. Selene did not look away. She did not flinch. "I still laugh," she said. And Mara, who had known her since they were 9, said nothing further, because they both understood what had just been demonstrated. The letters to her sister Clara had changed, without Selene quite deciding they would. Clara was 21, and still at home, still entirely herself, vivid and funny, and honest in the way only people who haven't yet been asked to stop can be. She wrote to Selene the way she always had, long, winding letters full of household observations and mild outrages and questions she actually wanted answered. Selene had written back the same way at first. Then the letters became shorter, more polished, newsy in a careful way. Events attended, acquaintances encountered, the Blackthorne estates described in terms that were accurate and revealed nothing. She still wrote faithfully, still signed them with love, still asked after Clara's life with what she told herself was genuine interest. But at some point, she had stopped writing the underneath parts, the parts about what it actually felt like to prepare herself each morning, the parts about the household protocols and the carriage rides home, the parts about the thing that lived in her chest lately. Not quite sadness, not quite anger, but a kind of pressure, a held breath, a sense of waiting for something she could no longer name. She told herself she was protecting Clara. She did not ask herself what she was protecting her from. The Hargrove Gala ended at 11. The carriage home was the sealed, private world that carriage rides always were. The city moving past the windows in soft amber light. The interior just large enough for 2 people to occupy without being close. Lucien sat across from her, composed in the particular way that indicated the evening had gone adequately. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the streets go by. She was tired. Not in her body, in something that didn't have an easy name, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing fluency in a language that isn't theirs for so long that they can no longer remember what their own sounds like. She said it before she had decided to. "I miss enjoying things." Her voice was even. She wasn't asking for anything. She understood by now the difference between statements and requests. "I attended 17 events last season, and I cannot recall a single moment of genuine pleasure in any of them. I'm not sure when that changed." She was not looking at him. She was looking at the city. A pause. Longer than a dismissal, shorter than consideration. "You have matured," Lucien said. 3 words, spoken without unkindness, offered, she understood, as a gift, as the correct interpretation of what she had described. She did not respond. She kept her eyes on the window, on the lights of the city sliding past, on the dark shapes of buildings against the night sky, on the small, ordinary world continuing outside the glass with complete indifference to the interior of one particular carriage. And she felt something that she had been, for many months, preventing herself from feeling completely. Not grief, exactly. Grief required a clean loss, a moment of before and after, with a clear seam between them. This was something slower, something that had happened in accumulated increments, in the pause before a threshold, in letters that said less than they used to, in a laugh she had mislaid so gradually she hadn't noticed until someone else pointed to the empty space where it had been. She was alone. Not physically. Physically, she was in a carriage across from her husband, returning from a party attended by 300 people in a city of thousands. She was surrounded, at every level, by the structures of a life that was full by any objective measure. She was alone in the specific way that becomes possible only inside a marriage, the loneliness that has no clean name, because it coexists with presence, with proximity, with a person sitting close enough to touch who nonetheless cannot find you, who has not, she understood now, ever looked. The carriage moved through the dark. Lucien said something about tomorrow's correspondence. She answered appropriately. Outside the window, the city carried on, indifferent and luminous, and entirely itself, and she watched it the way a person watches something they are no longer part of, and she was, in the deepest sense, completely quiet. Chapter 6. The Royal Winter Gathering was the most important social event of the season. Everyone understood this. It was not stated anywhere in the official invitation, which was cream-coloured and embossed and written in the formal language of a kingdom that had been performing its own grandeur for 300 years. But it did not need to be. The gathering was the event against which all other events were measured. Attendance was a statement, conduct was a record, and the room, which held the better part of the kingdom's titled nobility on any given year, had a memory that was long and precise and entirely without mercy. Selene had been preparing for it for 3 weeks. She had reviewed the guest list twice. She knew the alliances and the tensions and the particular fault lines that ran beneath the surface of this specific assembly of people. She had chosen her gown, deep blue, restrained, exactly the right register, and she had practiced, in the way she practiced everything now, the version of herself she would bring into that room. She was ready. The evening moved the way these evenings moved, with the slow, stately momentum of a river that knows exactly where it is going. The introductions, the careful choreography of conversation, the food, which was extraordinary, which no one commented on because commenting on food was not done. Lucien was at his most formidable in rooms like this, precise and magnetic in the way of people whose coldness reads, to those who don't know better, as depth. She stayed in her position. She played her part. She was, by any visible measure, flawless. It was close to 10 o'clock when it happened. Lord Cavendish was a man in his 60s who had accumulated, over the decades, the particular cruelty that grows in people who have never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He was telling a story, loudly for an audience of 6 or 7, who had gathered in the way audiences gather around men like him, through gravity rather than choice, and the story required a prop. The prop was a young footman. The boy could not have been older than 16. He had made some small error, a drink offered at the wrong moment, a step taken out of sequence, and Cavendish had caught it, and now he was using it. Using him. Describing the mistake in expanding, theatrical detail, imitating the boy's expression, inviting his audience's laughter. The footman stood where he was required to stand and looked at a fixed point on the wall with the rigid endurance of someone who has learned, recently and at cost, that stillness is the only available protection. The audience laughed, some uncomfortably, briefly, then away. Most without reservation. Selene heard it from 12 feet away. She stood with her champagne, and she watched, and she felt, clearly and without ambiguity, cutting through every careful layer she had constructed, something that was not composure, and not protocol, and not anything she had learned from 43 pages of household guidance. She counted to 10. An old habit. From before. She gave herself 10 seconds to be certain the thing she was about to do was chosen, not reactive, not impulsive, not a lapse in judgment. She gave herself 10 seconds to find a reason not to. She found none. She crossed the 12 feet with the measured pace of a woman who belonged in every room she entered. Lord Cavendish. Her voice carried the precise warmth of an old acquaintance, which she was not. "I have been looking for an opportunity all evening. Lady Cavendish mentioned you've been involved in the Northfield drainage project. I'd love to hear your perspective on the parliamentary vote." The story stopped. The audience shifted. Cavendish turned, recalibrating, caught between his performance and the social weight of a duchess who had addressed him by name with apparent interest. The footman remained still, but something in his posture changed, a fraction, invisible to most. She saw it. Cavendish, who was not a stupid man, recognized the redirection for what it was. He smiled, the particular smile of a man filing something away, and allowed himself to be led. The conversation moved. The moment dissolved. The boy slipped back into the structure of the evening and out of range. She thought it was over. She did not account for Lucien. He appeared at her side within 2 minutes, a fluid, unhurried movement that would read to any observer as a husband joining his wife. He touched her elbow lightly and drew her a half step aside, into a pocket of relative privacy at the edge of the room. The room was still full. 300 people occupied every direction. She understood, immediately, the particular intimacy of what was about to happen. Not private, but unwitnessed. Or nearly, because some people, close enough, would see his expression, and some would notice her stillness, and the room would not miss it. "What you just did," he said quietly, "was undermine a peer of this kingdom at a royal gathering. You inserted yourself into a private, social exchange. You drew attention to yourself in a way that will be noted and discussed, and will reflect on this family." His voice was low and even, and absolutely without heat. It was worse than anger. A duchess does not make herself the spectacle of the evening. She had heard versions of this before. Different words, the same architecture. Something shifted in her chest, not breaking exactly. More like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting, without her knowledge, for precisely this moment. The room was very quiet around them. 300 people, and the silence moved through them like weather. She looked at him. Really looked. Not the managed, calibrated attention she had been paying him for 2 years, but the kind of looking that arrives when there is nothing left to protect. When she spoke, her voice was low. It did not need to be loud to reach him. "I think you fell in love with an idea. Not a person. A beat. 2. She held his gaze for 1 moment longer, not in defiance, not in anger, in something sadder and more final than either. Then she turned and walked away. She crossed the marble floor with her shoulders straight and her steps even, and her gown moving around her like deep water, and she did not look back. Behind her, Lucien Blackthorne stood in the center of the most important room in the kingdom, and felt the thing he had no name for. It wasn't anger. It was the sound, small and irreversible, of something he had not known he was holding. Breaking. Chapter 7. She did not leave. This surprised people, or would have, if anyone had known enough to be surprised. The staff noticed the change first, the way they always did, but even they could not have said precisely what they expected to happen after the winter gathering. Something dramatic, perhaps. Bags packed, carriages summoned, the clean rupture of a woman making an exit. What happened instead was quieter, and, in its way, more complete. Selene simply stopped. She stopped preparing herself in doorways. She stopped the 3-second pause, the invisible adjustment, the tuning of herself to frequencies she had never naturally occupied. She stopped tracking where he was in the house so she could be correctly positioned when their paths crossed. She stopped reading the room before she entered it, and instead walked through the door the way she used to, as herself, at her own pace, carrying whatever she happened to be feeling without first deciding if it was appropriate. It did not happen all at once. It was not a declaration. There was no morning she woke and chose it consciously. It simply became, one day, the thing she was doing. The letter to Clara came first. She sat at the writing desk on a Thursday morning, with the pale winter light coming through the window, and she picked up her pen and she wrote the underneath parts. Not all of them, but enough. She wrote about the gathering, not the details but the feeling, what it had been like to walk across that floor, what it had cost, what had happened in the chest afterward, that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere between the two, and seemed, strangely, like the first honest thing she had felt in months. She wrote about missing laughter. She wrote about the kitchen and cook's Thursday sauce and how she had stopped going. She sealed it before she could reconsider. Clara wrote back within the week. 4 pages, dense, ardent. Entirely Clara. She did not offer advice or gentle suggestions or the careful distance that people sometimes adopt around difficult truths. She simply wrote back as though nothing had changed between them, as though the underneath had always been available, and Selene had simply chosen, for a while, not to use it. Which was true, which made it better and worse at once. She rearranged the sitting room, not dramatically. She moved 2 chairs closer to the window and shifted the writing table to face a different direction, toward the garden, which was skeletal in winter but still had its architecture, its bare, honest shape. She moved a lamp. She removed a painting that had always troubled her slightly. Something in the angle of the light, something cold in the brushwork, and replaced it with nothing, which left a clean rectangle of wall that she found she preferred. Mrs. Haverford discovered the changes during the morning rounds and stood for a moment in the doorway. Then she walked in and straightened the lamp, not back to where it had been, simply to its best position in the new arrangement, and continued with her rounds. She did not mention it to anyone, but she moved through the rest of the morning slightly lighter than she had in weeks. The kitchen. It started with the sauce again, on a Thursday, because some things circle back. She had come downstairs for something else entirely and been caught, at the turn of the corridor, by the smell of it. And she had stopped and allowed herself to be caught and kept walking toward it instead of away. Cook looked up. Neither of them said anything about the gap. Cook offered a spoon. Selene tasted it and made the sound, the genuine unguarded sound of a person who simply liked food. And Cook turned back to the stove with a small private expression that she didn't bother to conceal. Thomas the footman, passing through with a tray, heard the sound and stopped. He looked. Then he continued walking, and he was smiling, and he was not trying to hide that either. Lucien noticed the lamplight first, or rather, he noticed its absence. The sitting-room lamp, in the corner nearest the main corridor, it had always been lit in the evenings, and he had never consciously registered this until the evening it wasn't, because she was no longer in that room in the evenings, and so it went unlit, and the corridor outside it was darker than it had been. He stood at the doorway on a Wednesday night and looked at the changed furniture and the empty wall and the unlit lamp. He stood there longer than the observation required. The ledger was more difficult to explain, or would have been if he had been in the habit of explaining things to himself. He was in his study on a Friday, working through the quarterly accounts, which was straightforward and familiar work that he had done dozens of times without incident. He was productive until the middle of page 4, when something, a sound in the corridor, or the absence of one, caused his attention to lift. He looked at the door. She did not appear. He returned to the page. He read the same line 7 times. He could not have told you, at the end of those 7 readings, what it said. The numbers were there. He could see them, but they kept failing to become information, because part of his mind was somewhere else entirely, doing something he did not have clean language for. Listening. For a step in the corridor. A door. Some sound that indicated the specific weight of her presence in the house. There was nothing. He set down his pen. He looked at his hands on the desk, then at the window, then at the cold and quiet room around him. The house was the same house it had always been. Same walls, same fire, same dark and ordered silence. But something that had been in it was no longer oriented toward him, and the absence of that thing, which he had never once acknowledged as a presence, was so loud in the stillness that he could not read a single line of a ledger he had read 100 times before. He sat with this for a long time. He did not know what to do with it. That was new, too. Chapter 8. It was an accident. He would return to this fact repeatedly in the hours that followed, the way a man returns to a wound, not to reopen it, but because the location keeps asserting itself. It was an accident. He had not been looking. He was not that kind of man. And this was not a defense, but a simple truth. Lucien Blackthorne had never in his life felt compelled to look through another person's private things, because private things had always seemed to him like a category of information that did not bear on anything useful. He had gone into the sitting room for a book. His own book, a political history he had lent to no one, left on the side table by the window. Or so he had believed. The room was empty. The afternoon light was grey and beginning to soften. He crossed to the table and found not his book, but a smaller, leather-bound volume, dark green, plain. The kind of journal that is not meant to be noticed. It had fallen slightly open. He should have closed it. He stood at the table in the grey afternoon light and read one line, and the one line led to the next. And then he was sitting in the chair by the window, and the light was changing, and he was reading. The early entries were practical, observations about the household, notes on people she had met, alliances she was trying to understand, the careful social cartography of a woman learning a new territory. He recognized the intelligence in them, the precision, the pattern recognition, and felt, briefly, something that functioned like approval before he realized he was doing it, and registered how absurd it was to be approving of a private journal no one had asked him to read. Then the entries changed. October. I corrected my posture 14 times today, not because I was told to, because I have started doing it before I am told to. He read this twice. He moved forward. November. He said the dinner conversation was well managed. I held this for 3 days. I have become the kind of person who holds a half compliment for 3 days, which is information about the frequency of the other kind. He felt something shift in his chest. He kept reading. I wrote to Clara today and deleted the true parts. I am not sure when I started doing this. I think I tell myself I am protecting her from worry. I think this is not entirely honest. The rain began outside. He did not hear it at first. He told me that warmth reads as performance. I have been practicing removing the warmth. I think it is working. I think this is not the correct goal, and I am pursuing it anyway, which is its own kind of information. He turned the page. There is a version of this man I believed in at the beginning. I still believe the version exists. Somewhere underneath the composure and the protocols and the corrections. I keep looking for evidence. Some days I think I almost find it. Then he moves the line, and I move with it. And I look up, and I don't know how far I've walked or where I started. He set the journal down. He picked it up again. The staff are kind to me. Thomas brought extra wood for the sitting-room fire without being asked. Mrs. Haverford remembers how I take my tea. Dora learned, without my saying, that I prefer the morning quiet before the day formally begins. They have studied me carefully. I think they are compensating for something I am not supposed to name. He thought of the household he had managed for a decade, the people he had employed and directed, and, he had believed, provided for well. He had never considered that they might be providing for something he was not. February. I have been trying to locate the moment when I stopped being a person in this house and became a performance of one. I cannot find it exactly. That's what frightens me. If there had been a moment, I think I would have caught it. Instead, it was 1,000 small moments, and I stepped through each one willingly, and now I am here. He was here. He was in the sitting room with a journal he had not meant to open, and rain beginning against the glass, and the particular quality of stillness that arrives when something cannot be untaken. He said I had matured. I understood, in that moment, what I had lost, and what he could not see. Both things at once. I looked out the window and thought, I am completely alone, and I chose this, and I did not know I was choosing it. That is the part I keep returning to. Not the alone, the not knowing. He turned the pages with deliberate care now, as though speed might damage something. I rearranged the sitting room today. I moved the chairs to face the window. It seems very small, but it felt like the first honest thing I had done in this house in a long time, choosing where to sit without asking what the correct choice was. I went to the kitchen. Cook offered me a spoon. I felt, for approximately 4 minutes, like myself. He closed the journal. He did not close it to stop. There was no stopping now. The way there is no stopping a tide by closing your eyes against it. He closed it because he had reached the end of what was written, and the last line of the last entry was still sitting in him, and would not settle. I wonder if he has ever been curious about me. Not about my conduct, not about my management of his household or my performance at his gatherings. About me. What I find funny. What I loved before I edited it. What I sound like when I am not trying. I wonder if it has ever occurred to him to want to know. The rain was steady now. He could hear it against the glass, against the garden, against the grey and indifferent afternoon. He sat in the chair by the window. Her chair, he realized. She had moved it here, towards the light, and he looked at nothing in particular, and he did not move. The room held him. Outside, the rain fell on the bare winter garden, on the ordered gravel paths, on everything he had built and maintained and controlled without once understanding what it cost. He sat for a very long time, and for the first time in 34 years, Lucien Blackthorne did not know what to do next, and he did not, for once, pretend that he did. Chapter 9. He began badly. This was, in retrospect, predictable. A man who had spent his entire life solving problems with precision, discovering that precision was the wrong instrument. He approached her the morning after the journal, with the intention of speaking directly, which was the only mode of communication he had ever genuinely trusted, and what came out was structured and considered and landed on her like a formal address. I have been reflecting, he said, on certain patterns in my conduct over the course of our marriage. She looked at him over her tea. Her expression was attentive, composed. patient in the way that people are patient when they have learned that patience is the safest available posture. It was, he realized with a clarity that arrived too late, the expression he had trained her to wear. "I believe I have held you to standards that were—" He paused. He had the next word, but it resisted him, unreasonable, in their application, in their— "And I— Thank you, Lucien," she said, quietly, warmly, with the precise warmth of a woman who had spent 2 years calibrating warmth to the temperature that closed a conversation without offending. He stopped. He recognized it. That was the unbearable part. He recognized it completely now, in the way you can only recognize something once someone has shown you how to look. He had built this careful, courteous distance. He had constructed it, correction by correction, and she had learned to live inside it. And now he was standing at the door of it, asking to be let in, and she was, politely, correctly, with exquisite composure, leaving him outside. He nodded once and left the room. The flowers were worse. He sent them 3 days later. Not roses, he had enough self-awareness to avoid the obvious, but something more considered, a winter arrangement, dark and architectural. He included a card which he rewrote 4 times, and the final version said something he had meant genuinely, and which read, on paper, like a business apology. She thanked him in person. Briefly, warmly. The flowers went into the sitting room. She looked at them the way she looked at well-chosen furniture, with aesthetic appreciation, 0 personal meaning. Found the Duke standing outside the sitting-room doorway later that afternoon, looking at the arrangement with an expression she had never seen on him before. She had, in 20 years of service, seen him annoyed, focused, satisfied, occasionally severe. She had not seen him at a loss. She moved past him without comment, which was the kindest thing she could offer. He tried conversation. This was perhaps the most painful of the attempts, because conversation was something Lucien had always considered himself capable of. He spoke well, he argued well, he could carry a dinner table without effort. What he discovered, in the careful and increasingly desperate exchanges of the following week, was that he had never learned to converse with her. He had talked at her, alongside her, about things that required her attention. He had never simply talked. He asked what she was reading. She told him. He asked a follow-up question. She answered it. The exchange was pleasant and complete, and left him feeling more separate than silence. He asked about Clara. Her face shifted. Briefly, a flicker of something real, before the composure returned, and she said her sister was well and gave him the surface version. He had read about Clara in the journal. He knew what the real version would contain. He had no right to it, and she had no reason to offer it. And both of these things were true simultaneously, and the combination of them was a specific kind of consequence he was learning to sit inside. He stopped trying to fix it. This was not a strategy. Strategies were things he constructed deliberately, and this was something different, an exhaustion of method, a morning when he woke up and understood with the simple clarity of a man who has run out of alternatives that there was nothing to fix. A fixed thing was a thing restored to its original condition. There was no original condition to restore. What there might be, what there possibly, cautiously might be, was something new, built differently, and he had no blueprint for that, which meant he could not build it. He could only be present for it if it came. So he began being present. He came to the reading room in the evenings. Not every evening. Not in a way that announced itself or established a pressure. The first time was a Tuesday. He brought his own book, sat in the chair near the fire, and read. She was already there, in her chair by the window, with her own book and the lamp she preferred, and the particular quality of stillness she had when she was genuinely absorbed. She looked up when he entered. He said, "I won't disturb you." And then he sat down and read. And he didn't. He came back Thursday. He came back the following Monday. He said nothing remarkable on any of these occasions. He did not engineer conversations, or create openings, or position the evenings as opportunities for something larger. He brought his book and he sat near the fire, and occasionally he looked up at the window, or the rain, or the middle distance, and once he laughed, briefly, involuntarily, at something on his page. She glanced over. He showed her the passage without comment. She read it. Something moved across her face, the almost laugh, the one that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. She returned the book. She said nothing, but she had looked, directly for a moment, not the managed attention, not the composed regard, the real kind. She noticed all of it. She was not built, whatever the last 2 years had tried to make her, to stop noticing. She noticed the flowers and the failed conversation, and the morning apology that had emerged structured and landed wrong. She noticed the evenings in the reading room and the book he had shown her, and the way he sat near the fire without demanding anything from the air between them. She filed it all somewhere careful. But noticing was not the same as trusting. She knew this, held it clearly, without drama or bitterness, as simple fact. A woman does not dismantle 2 years of careful armor because a man has spent 3 weeks being quietly present. The armor had been built against something real, correction by real correction, silence by real silence. It had been built to last, and she was not yet sure, could not yet know, whether what was happening in the reading room in the evenings was a man changing or a man waiting. The difference mattered. She intended to find out, but not yet. For now she sat in her chair by the window with her book and her lamp, and she let him be in the room, and that was all. That was, for now, enough. Chapter 10. She told him on a Wednesday morning, not asked, not framed as a request, not softened with qualifications, not offered in the tentative way she had once offered everything, already pre-adjusted, pre-apologized for, shaped to take up the minimum possible space. She simply told him, "I'm going to Clara's," she said. "I'll be gone 4 days." He was at his desk. He looked up. Something moved across his face. Not objection, not calculation, but something more unguarded than either. Something that looked, briefly, like the awareness of what her telling rather than asking meant. He said, "I hope it's a good visit." She looked at him for a moment, the real kind of looking, the kind she had been allowing herself again lately in careful increments. Then she nodded and left the room. She did not analyze the exchange on her way out. She let it be exactly what it was. Clara was Clara, vivid and warm and constitutionally unable to be careful for longer than approximately 4 minutes. She met Selene at the door of the Ashford estate, with her arms already open, and the hug was the kind that said, "I received your letters. I know. I'm not going to make you explain it." They talked for 4 days. Not about Lucien, specifically, or not only. They talked about everything that had accumulated in the space between the careful letters and the real ones. They talked about what Selene had been before and what she was finding her way back to, and the difference between those 2 things, which was not as large as she'd feared, and not as small as she'd hoped. They argued once, briefly, about something entirely unrelated, and Selene won, and neither of them pretended she hadn't. She laughed 3 times on the first day. Real laughter, the kind with no audience, no calibration, no assessment of whether it was the right amount. On the fourth evening, she sat at the window of her childhood bedroom and looked at the garden in the early dark, and she thought about the reading room and the fire and the book he had shown her, and she thought about the man standing outside the sitting-room doorway, looking at flowers he had sent that had landed wrong. She held these things without conclusion. Then she packed her bag, and in the morning she went home. She found them outside her bedroom door, not arranged formally, not a florist's construction, not the architectural winter arrangement of the first attempt. These were from the south garden, she could tell immediately. The ones that still held through the early cold, the ones she had stopped to look at once, weeks ago, on a morning walk she hadn't known anyone had observed. Dark stems. A few late roses, almost finished. Some smaller things she didn't know the name of, gathered with the imprecision of a man who had not done this before and had not asked for help. No note. She stood in the corridor and looked at them for a long moment. A note would have been language, and language was what he knew, and he had chosen not to use it, had left instead only this imperfect, inarticulate thing, which said more by being imperfect than a note ever could. She carried them inside. She put them in water. She sat with them in the lamplight for a while, doing nothing else. She came to the library that evening. He was already there, in the chair near the fire, which she had come to think of as his chair in the evenings, the way she had her chair by the window. His book was open. The fire was high. The room smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the particular stillness of a house that has found, tentatively, a new kind of quiet. He looked up when she entered. He did not speak. He did not arrange his expression into anything. She saw him, for a moment, simply as he was, uncertain and present and trying in the only way he currently knew how. He moved, a slight, deliberate shift, away from the lamp on his side of the fireplace toward the center, which opened the second chair. An offering, no words around it. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. Then she crossed the room and sat down. She opened her book. He returned to his. The fire moved between them, warm and indifferent, and outside the winter dark pressed against the windows, and the house held them both in its old stone silence. They read. The first hour passed without event. The second followed. Occasionally one of them turned a page. Once the fire shifted, and he leaned forward to add wood, and she glanced over, and he glanced up, and their eyes met for a moment over the small ordinary task of keeping a room warm. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. There was no speech. There was no moment of declaration, no scene in which things were named and catalogued and resolved. She did not forgive him in words because forgiveness was not, she had come to understand, a single transaction. It was not something you handed over in one piece. It was something that arrived slowly, unevenly, in the small decisions to remain present rather than retreat, to sit in the room, to accept the chair, to bring your book and stay for 2 hours without demanding anything more of the moment than the moment was. She was not all the way back. She knew this, held it clearly, not as accusation, but as truth. The armor didn't dissolve in an evening. Trust was not a room you entered at once. It was a threshold you crossed in increments, and she was on the threshold, and that was further than she had been. And it was enough. For now it was enough. She turned a page. He turned a page. The fire burned low and then lower, and neither of them moved to leave. And at some point the winter dark outside the windows became the specific dark of late evening, and the house settled into its nighttime sounds around them. And two people sat in a library in the honest quiet of a beginning. Not an ending, not a restoration, but something new and fragile and real. And they were, simply, present, with each other. At last. She was never the problem. She was the proof that the right person, in the wrong conditions, will slowly become someone they don't recognize. Lucien had everything: the title, the power, the perfectly ordered life. What he didn't have was the wisdom to see what he was losing until the silence she left behind became louder than anything she had ever said. He learned just in time. And so they began again. Not from the altar, not from a grand declaration, but from two chairs beside a fire, and the quiet, deliberate choice to finally be real with each other. Some love stories end with a kiss. This one ended with something rarer. Two people, one room, no performance, just the truth, and the decision to stay inside it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next one. Thank you, and I will see you in my next story.